a friend of mine said, if this was a country where it was like, 13,000 white children having died, there would be a ceasefire by now. And I said, what's so sad? I don't agree with that, because we have an epidemic of gun violence in this country, and it's not just black and brown children, it's white children as well, and more specifically, wealthy white children have been murdered. Right? Wealthy white children. You look at Parkland, you look at Sandy Hook. Those are wealthy white children.
Mm-hmm.
And so the interconnectedness is that a white supremacist hyper capitalist society will eat any and everything in its path.
Welcome to the Kindness Is podcast, presented by Kind Cotton, where we take a deep dive into the true meaning of kindness. I'm your host, co-founder of Kind Cotton, Kaitlin Johnstone. Let's dive in.
Wake up.
About 4 or 5 years ago, my best friend sent me a page of an incredible activist on Instagram. I immediately dove in, started reading all of the posts, listening to all of his stories, purchasing his books and reading them, and never would I have imagined that I would have the honor and privilege to be interviewing him today. Frederick Joseph is a 2-time New York Times best-selling author of The Black Friend and Patriarchy Blues, Better Than We Found It, and Black Panther, Wakanda Forever, The Courage to Dream. He was recognized for the International Literacy Association's 2021 Children's and Young Adults Book Award and was a 2019 Forbes 30 Under 30 list maker. His forthcoming literary works are his debut poetry collection, which I cannot wait for, We Alive Beloved, his debut novel, This Thing of Ours, and a nonfiction essay collection. When I tell you that I started thinking about the fact that I can't believe that I'm going to be sharing the same space as this human today, I am not exaggerating. His work has helped me continue to grow, continue to reevaluate the way in which I have seen the world. I hope that you listen today with an open heart and an open mind, and that you leave this podcast learning something new. So, I was refreshing myself on all of your work, all of your amazing work leading up to this podcast. And just this morning, even, I was listening to Patriarchy Blues, which it was a re-listen for me. And there was something in the very beginning that struck me, and I wanted to read it and kind of like kickstart the conversation from there, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So, you are more than the trauma you've endured, and you can be more than the trauma you've caused. That sits with me potentially more than any other quote you've ever shared. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think that idea sits at the core of much of my work. It is a guiding principle, a theory of change, a pedagogy, if you would. Because if I don't believe that, not just about myself, but about the people around me, then what's the point of the work, right? As an author, as a essayist, as a poet, as a soon-to-be novelist with my novel releasing next year, that's incorporated in every single thing that I do. As a person who, is a philanthropist and raises money for people, right? Like, I have to believe that we are greater than our pain and in all ways, shapes, and forms. Because if not, then why do we do any of this?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I think that makes so much sense. And you talk a lot about, too, of that kind of being a path to freedom, not only for yourself, but for other people. And it's interesting, being a white woman in an anti-racist space many times, I have to remind myself over and over and over again that, like, this work is never done, that you're always going to continue to mess things up, that you need to, like, humble yourself within the messing of things up and recognize that there are things larger than your ego, which is like somewhere I feel as though a lot of us get tripped up. Would you agree with that? Like, regardless of what it is, right? Because a lot of your work is very intersectional in that, you know, you may not be causing harm in one way, but you could be in another area.
Right, right. No, 100%. I think we have to, as best as we can, look at, again, the intersectionality of not just the moments and whatnot, but ourselves, right? We have to
Mhm.
first understand who we are in all of our various identities, right? So like, I grew up in poverty. I no longer live in poverty, right? And so I have a perspective as an example of someone who grew up in poverty, but I was lucky enough to kind of come out of that. And so I can't speak for people who currently in 2024 live in poverty, right? I can ask questions, I can try to understand, but the reality of it is that identity is no longer my identity. So we're all like also moving pieces, right? We're
Mm.
fluctuating as human beings. I'm someone who has multiple sclerosis, so I have a disability, but I don't have a visible disability. So even on a scale of privilege in terms of disability, I have to understand my disability is not the same thing as a person who might have so obviously something more visible, like I said, but even a person who has multiple sclerosis and is in a wheelchair, right? We're
Mhm.
experiencing two different scales of the same disability. And so if you do that work, that internal interrogation of who you are, that is the first step to actually stepping into the world and trying to understand how you can best show up for other people.
Yeah. Would you say, because I was going to ask you about your diagnosis with MS, would you say that that was somewhat of an awakening for you in various areas when it comes to being involved in the work that you're involved in?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I grew up just like in a family where it was important to do like my grandmother would always say, if you have hands, use them to do good work, right?
Mm.
And so I just kind of grew up in a family where my mom would, even when we were in poverty, my mom would still be like, okay, well, you've grown out of these clothes, and therefore let's give these clothes to someone else who can use them, right? And we didn't have much to begin with, and she's already thinking about how we can support somebody else. So I think in terms of showing up for community, showing up through empathy and humanity, I think that's always been instilled in me. But I think when I was diagnosed with MS, it exacerbated my desire to show up as grand as I potentially could
Mhm.
while still here, right? Because you start you start considering mortality more, right? I was diagnosed at 24 years old, right? And as a Black person in America, I had already thought of mortality through the lens of just leaving my home. Now I'm thinking of mortality through the lens of not being able to stand up in the shower and potentially cracking my head open, or just not being able to remember things, so on and so forth. And so I think the intersection of my own mortality made me want to leave a legacy that I could be proud of even by my mid 30s, my early 40s, so on and so
Mm.
forth.
That's a really interesting point. And you also spoke about something that I feel like can really anyone can relate to in your book about how your 20s were spent like drinking cheap well drinks and going out with other people who wanted to be in like hot and sweaty environments dancing and you didn't have quote unquote a care in the world. Whereas in your 30s, when you start
Yeah.
to dive into more about what's important to you and your morals and your passions and humanity, you started kind of recognizing the importance of valuing friendships in that light.
Right, right. No, 100%. I think that, again, I was always someone who, I would go to the local shelter and again give clothes, or donate to the Red Cross or something. I don't know, but I wasn't invested in like the quote unquote work. The work wasn't like an integral part of my daily life at the time. And I do think that even after getting diagnosed, I kind of went through this phase of, like, I flew to New Zealand, for example, and started base jumping. So I was just like, well, my thought was, oh, I'm probably going to die young, so let me just do all this wild stuff now. And so some of that wild stuff was base jumping. Some of that wild stuff was, I guess kind of being, a bit promiscuous, if you would, and being at the club and spending all my money and things like that. And then I really tie it to the combination of both having MS and also my younger brother being born. I was just kind of like, I would show up to my mom's home on weekends after partying, all like I would go over there every Sunday to see my little brother. And I would have like the night before maybe been in like a bar fight or been, came from some person's home whose name I don't know, whatever. And I would go up there and, my little brother at the time was maybe like 2 or 3, and he would just like look at me and I'm like, I need to do more for you. I need to give you something better to look up to because this isn't it. And then, again, there's nothing wrong with like, leading certain lives, but I think that we can be more.
Yeah. I agree wholeheartely. Is that when you started writing, or had you always been a writer?
So I went to school. I went to school for both poli-sci and creative writing. And I only went to school for creative writing to honor my grandmother. My grandmother was a writer, never got to be published, but she taught me the art of writing at 3-4 years old. I've been writing since I was a kid, I've always loved writing. I was always in AP English, and so on and so forth, right? Winning all the essay contests. But I have been told by an English teacher of mine that I wasn't a good writer. And therefore, while I studied writing and had to write for school, I didn't see myself as a writer in terms of career. And then, a friend of mine found one of my old essays. I was in my 20s at this point, and he's like, this is really good. Like I was like going through my old stuff and I had a printout of it. He's like, this is really, really good. I'm like, oh no, it's garbage. Because I saw myself through the lens of being garbage from a white supremacist educator. Right. And so I spent 12, 13 years thinking I was a bad writer. My roommate friend submits the essay to a competition. I win the competition without even knowing that I had been submitted to the competition. And he's like, hey, just to let you know, you're a writer. And you're a damn good writer. And so that kind of kicked it off, where I was like, okay, I can really, really focus on my writing much more.
That's amazing. You have a good friend. I hope that's one of the ones you still have around, because that's a pretty incredible story. You touched upon something there that is very, I feel like personal to me, having been a white woman educator, right? 80% of teachers out there are white women. And something else that I feel like is even more and more prevalent nowadays, right? With the harmful legislation that you see out there, such as the Stop Woke Act in Florida, or just all of these things that are coming down the pipe that are literal acts of white supremacy. Why is that so dangerous? I mean, not only for Black and brown children, but for all children.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, and I posted something about this recently, the goal is to foster a generation of fascists, right? That is the goal. It's as plain as day. And when people think of fascism, I think that, especially in a contemporary sense, I think that people think solely of white supremacy. But fascism is inclusive of class stratification. It's inclusive of bodily autonomy. Is inclusive, like a fascist nation will decimate anybody on the margins, right? And that's why it's important. You're talking about women. You're talking about the LGBTQ plus IA community. You're talking about Black and brown people. You're talking about disabled people. You're talking about people living in poverty. You're talking about everyone who is essentially not a cis-het white Judeo-Christian middle to upper middle class and rich person, right? Like everyone else is, in that situation, decimated, right? Like absolutely decimated. And so it's important that we understand that, the war on woke and the war on books and the war on curriculum and the war on libraries and the war on educators and librarians and and school lunch and so on and so forth is to reduce the humanity of a generation and mold them into something of a soldier for fascism. Right. And so it's a battle that we all need to be waging. And I posted recently, I just said, look, this is a right-wing war that's being waged, but it's a left-wing war that is not being shown up for as best as it could. Right.
That
I
part.
think, yeah, there are definitely people doing the work, like in progressive spaces and in leftist spaces, and even some, centrist and neoliberal spaces, but the work is not being done as it needs to be because, for me, I take my job very seriously because I primarily write for young people. I take my job extremely seriously because I look at myself as another harbinger of the message of educators and parents, right? And we need to help we need to help the educators. We can't just leave it up to what's happening in the four walls of those schools because again, the schools are a battleground, right? Parents, and I know it's hard because parents are just trying to make it, but parents need to also be as invested as the teachers, right? Like as the librarians, right? It's my job to help the parents. We have to work together. We're going to lose. And so that's a long way of saying like that's that's why everybody should care about what's going on.
Yeah. Why do you think people don't?
I think people do care. I think there's multiple things, right? I somewhat spoke to one of them for a split second just now. People are preoccupied with trying to survive, right? So there's that. Yeah. Anyone who's not privileged enough to have, economic certainty is if you're working a shift at Walmart and you're also working a shift at a hospital and so on and so forth, you're getting home and you're bone tired. You barely have time to even cook for your family, for your children, let alone also read with them or suggest books or so there's that. I also think that this is not new. We are seeing the manifestation of a war that started primarily with Ronald Reagan, right? So now you have like me, I'm a millennial. And I'm a millennial who is a manifestation in terms of like the things that have happened to me. My father was incarcerated and caught up in the drug epidemic and so on and so forth, and the war on drugs and da 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 da. That's by design, politically and policy wise, from the Reagan era. So by the time you get to me, right, I'm lucky in that I had a really strong family still, but a lot of people didn't. So you now have people who might have struggled with the same manifestations of like, Reagan era policies and Bush era policies and even some of the Clinton era policies. And now what we've become are a generation or generations of people who not only don't have the time, but don't know how to parent or educate people in a certain way because we weren't taught it.
Yeah, I guess what I'm thinking of are the people who are almost blissfully ignorant. And that's something that you've spoken about too.
Gotcha.
And this is something like having been someone who took COVID more seriously than anyone I know. And thank you. I always appreciated your posts about that and your solidarity and mask wearing and all of that. I would think about this all the time and I would get enraged. I mean, enraged. And my partner would try to say to me, you have to focus on the things that you can control. And I said, that's all well and good when the things I can control are the things that are affecting me. But the way in which other people's blissful ignorance is affecting me is harmful, right? Because like if everyone would have just collectively come together, I do believe still even to this day, we would have had a different outcome. So I guess I should have framed the question as, what do you think about that? Why are so many people still blissfully ignorant?
Because it benefits them to be, right? I think like at the end of the day, we have to understand that people are in bubbles of not just, I think, obviously power, but also bubbles of toxic positivity. This is one of the things I've been harping on a lot in the last year or so, is that I think for many people, we've quote unquote come out of the pandemic, which we have not. People are dying every single day, right? But for those who have this idea that we've come out of the pandemic or something like that, they are trying to be in this mental place of joy and positivity, and I can respect that, but you can't erase the realities though. And I think that people have chosen, like, two things to be true. Like, I can easily sit on here and have a real discussion with you about real issues, and we can also make a few jokes and have a good time as well, right? It's to be true. Doesn't mean us talking about real things and the realities that we're facing doesn't inherently mean a lack of joy. But people have solely chosen joy to the point where it becomes toxic because you're acting like the other things don't exist. So I think that people are not solely blissfully ignorant. They are opting into not caring, right? It's easier to not care, you know?
Yeah.
And that's the hard part, right? Like, I say all the time, like, I was in high school when 9/11 happened, and then I was in college when the recession happened and the housing crisis and so on and so forth. And then I was after that you then had Trump, and then and then right after, and I was in, I think, grad school at the time, and then right after that you get the pandemic, right? And so realistically now you have not that now obviously it's been going on for the entirety of the existence of this nation, but you have what's happening to Palestinians. So realistically, I get it, because my entire life has been juxtaposed and paralleled to atrocities. I'm like, oh man, I really wish I would have caught the white picket 90s, but it just, that's not my reality, and I have to understand that and just keep fighting. But I get people wanting to erase the truth, right?
Can you maybe talk a little bit about how we're all interconnected, and just because right now we're sitting in a space of comfort, and when I say that, again, that can be very intersectional, right? Like, I'm sitting in a space of comfort in that, like, I have financial stability and I am a white, straight passing cis woman in America, right? But I do believe in many ways that we are all interconnected, and that white supremacy and white supremacy culture and everything that goes with that is actually going to harm all of us.
I mean, it already has, right?
Yeah.
Like, the reality of it is I was having a conversation this morning in a group chat about Aaron Bushnell's him setting himself on fire, and rest in peace, Aaron. I found out a few minutes ago that he did pass away. And a friend of mine said, if this was a country where it was like 13,000 white children having died, there would be a ceasefire by now. And I said, what's so sad? I don't agree with that. And the reason I don't agree with that, and this is the interconnectedness of everything, is because we have an epidemic of gun violence in this country, and it's not just Black and brown children, it's white children as well, and more specifically, wealthy white children have been murdered, right? Wealthy white children. You look at Parkland, you look at Sandy Hook. Those are wealthy white children. And so the interconnectedness is that a white supremacist, hyper-capitalist society will eat any and everything in its path. Any and everything, right? It can take my children as well as your children, right? My humanity as well as your humanity. What we are seeing now. My wife has endometriosis. My wife is a biracial, Black and white, fair-skinned woman raised by a white mother, and in having endometriosis, we've had to try the process of IVF, and she's had to freeze her eggs, right? And we have a ton of class privilege. And based on what happens in the next election, we might be looking at criminal charges because we decided to go to process of IVF because of her endometriosis, right? And that is not just us. That is literally now every person, white, Black, brown, anybody who decided to do IVF, right?
Yeah.
Right? You're talking about bodily autonomy was not just ripped away from Black and brown women in the South. It's ripped away from everybody, in all these different places, and it might be through the entire nation, right? All these things in front of us, while they may first have the deepest impact on the most marginalized communities, they will inherently impact every community, every single community. Because I think even with Parkland, not the funny thing, but the sad thing is with Parkland, a lot of those children who were murdered in Parkland in that wealthy school, right? They were the children of Republican parents in Florida.
In Florida, yeah.
In Florida.
Mm-hmm.
It will happen to your children as a white, cishet, Republican, wealthy person are not absolved of the beast that is the pitfalls of this nation.
I always say to people too that, I mean, climate is obviously coming for all of us too.
That's it. Yes, exactly. Like, you know, it's so funny. There's so much, right? And there's just so much. It's so just eat climate, right? Just like climate alone, take away everything else. The existential crisis of climate, right? If you live in a Louisiana, if you live in a Florida, if you live in parts of California, if you live on any coast, if you are talking about being